Okay, we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 this morning. It's a little bit longer than what we can cover in one Sunday, so we're going to split it up into two parts. We'll be looking at 7, 1 through 14 this morning. Now, chapter 6, verses 10 through 12 is the official middle of the book, particularly as the Masoretic scribes mark those kinds of things off. And we do see a significant turn in the book as we get to chapter 7. Broadly speaking, the book is more positive in the second half than in the first. Now we have to qualify that a bit because it's not completely negative in the first half. It's not completely positive in the second half. But I think it's fair to say that the second half is more positive. And the second half is really dealing with the issues that are raised in the first half. You're familiar with it by now, the fact that Solomon is trying to answer this very difficult question: what advantage or what profit is there for man in all his activity under the sun? He's looking at that from all different angles, and he's raised a lot of issues as he's done that. In the second half, he's trying to give some answers at least. It might not be completely satisfying for us. I'm not sure that they're completely satisfying for Solomon himself, but that he's at least trying to give us some counsel in light of the difficulties and inequities of this life. There's a commentator named Crenshaw that says that Solomon's intention with this practical advice, and he's talking about the advice in 7, 1 to 14 in particular, was to exhort Israel to fear God and to live obedient lives that would please Him. Now, more specifically, as we get to chapter 7, there's a significant turn in that up through chapter 6, it's a primarily first-person narrative. There's a little bit mixed in there that's not, but as we get to chapter 7, we're going to see that Solomon turns to a series of proverbs as he gives us his counsel, and that fits with him as the author, right? We've already learned from 1 Kings that in addition to being king over Israel, Solomon was a sage. He was a professional wisdom guy, and he studied life to understand how it worked. Wisdom is actually a feature that God has built into the fabric of creation. And for Solomon and for many men during his day, I would argue even for men today, people study and try to figure out how life works and what's the purpose in life. We read this passage before, but I just want to read it again to remind you the level of wisdom that Solomon had. It's really quite incredible. He was already a wise man, as we saw, even before he had this opportunity to ask of God whatever he wanted to. He asked for wisdom, and God gave him all kinds of wisdom in all kinds of areas of life. Here's what 1 Kings 4, 30 through 34 says. Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. Egypt was a country that had a very strong wisdom tradition. They're trying to do the same thing that Solomon was doing. I'm sure they came up with different answers, but sometimes there are similar proverbs that Solomon has in his writings. Solomon was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, Haman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol. His fame was known in all the surrounding nations. He had a worldwide reputation for being a wise man. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs. We have some of those in the book of Proverbs. And his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that's in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that grows on the wall. So I think sometimes we think of wisdom as something that deals with very practical issues of life and things that we have to know to make good decisions. But it's broader than that. It's really knowledge and wisdom about all of life. And he had that kind of wisdom. He spoke also of animals and birds, creeping things and fish. And men came from all peoples to hear the wisdom of Solomon, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So, as we've said before, this made Solomon extremely qualified to be the one to launch this investigation of what profit there is for man and all his activity under the sun. It also makes him extremely qualified to give us counsel in light of the things that he discovered in his investigation. Of course, this wisdom is well illustrated for us from the book of Proverbs. It does contain a portion of those 3,000 proverbs that 1 Kings mentioned. It also contains collections of proverbs that the other men came up with. Solomon assembled those together in his book. It's also well illustrated from the book of Job. Job is also part of the wisdom literature. I'm more convinced than ever that Solomon is the one that wrote Job, even though it doesn't say that explicitly. And you know the relationship between those two books. Proverbs gives us the way that things generally work, general maxims of wisdom. It doesn't deal with the exceptions. Everything's pretty black and white in the book of Proverbs. Job does deal with the exceptions to these maxims, and actually provides for us a case study of a very prominent theme in Ecclesiastes, and that is that wisdom is not a fail-safe guarantee of a good life. Job lived very wisely, and for much of his life he was blessed as a result of that wisdom. But God intervened, and God reserves the right to do that. God can override normal wisdom outcomes for his own good purposes. He doesn't even have to explain to us why. So the thrust of Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes is that ultimate wisdom is to fear God and keep his commandments. All right, let's think a little bit about, just as a run-up to what we're going to look at in chapter 7. Chapter 6, again, in 1 through 12, Solomon looked at the flip side of the enjoyment refrain that ends chapter 5. And that is the one to whom God had granted riches and wealth and honor, and yet had not given him the ability to enjoy those things. And we talk about an abundance of money, a full treasury, an abundance of children, which was very important in Solomon's day, still is important to us today. Children provide great joy in this life, and the relationships of family. So that would be part of the abundance. And then finally, a full lifespan, plenty of years to enjoy both an abundance of material wealth and have the money that you need to do the things that you want to do, and also plenty of years to enjoy your family. Solomon says that if a man had all these things and yet God had not empowered him to enjoy them, better off a miscarriage than such a man. It's a strong thing to say, but it really gets the point across. Better off never to come into the world than even to come into the world and have an abundance and not be able to enjoy it. Key lesson out of all that is that our ability to enjoy good things from God is directly tied to our spiritual condition, particularly to the fact, recognizing the fact that everything that we have is from God. Everything that we go through is controlled by God. Now, at the conclusion of chapter 6, Solomon dealt with two major topics. One was the elusiveness of satisfaction, and we've all experienced that. No matter what we have, we're not completely content. We either want more or we want something better. It's just part of our human nature. And then secondly, man's powerlessness and the Lord's sovereignty. We have to keep in mind that the world is the way it is, and even we are the way that we are because God has designed it so. He's the one who subjected the creation to futility. There's certain things about this life, regardless of how hard we try, that we can't change, we can't fix, and we have to trust the Lord through that. Now, in the 8th and final time in the book, Solomon asked, and this is another hint that there's a significant turn in the book here. In chapter 6, verse 11, he asked for the final time, what then is the advantage to a man? That's the same question, in essence, that he's asking back in chapter 1. Then in the first part of verse 12 in chapter 6, he says, for who knows what is good for a man during his lifetime, during the few years of his futile life? Well, in chapter 7, he starts to try to answer that question by giving some very practical counsel on things that are good for a man as he lives his life under the sun. More literally, he's looking at things that are better than other things. That's kind of the way Proverbs works oftentimes. This is a comparison between two things and one being better than the other. Now, we talked about futility having, this word in Hebrew, having multiple meanings. And one of them is irony. Something that doesn't seem right, it doesn't seem to fit with what you expect. And there is irony in what Solomon says here in a couple of different ways. One, just within chapter 7 itself, he says that there are certain things that are better than other things, but when you look at what he's talking about in chapter 7, it's not the things that you would expect to be better than other things. So there's irony in that sense. There's also contrast and irony between chapter 6 and chapter 7. Think about this. Think about the content of chapter 6. It teaches that you can experience great prosperity and still not have joy. What chapter 7 teaches is that you can experience adversity and not be without joy. So there's certainly a level of irony there. I want to make one more general observation about chapter 7 before we get into the text, and that is the correspondence between chapter 7 and what Solomon recorded for us back in chapter 3. Here's the way that David Dorsey describes this, and this is not something that you might catch on to at first notice, but now that I point it out to you, I think you'll see its very obvious connection. This unit, talking about the unit in chapter 7, appears to intentionally echo the poem about time in 3:1-15. Specific echoes and allusions include references to death, birth, mourning, laughter, destroying, good times, bad times, what God has done, etc. You can see all of those in both chapters. It seems that in 7:1-14, the author is offering practical advice in response to the poem about time. Yes, there is a time to be born and a time to die, as 3:2 says, but the day of death is better than the day of birth, according to 7:1. And it's better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, for death is the destiny of every person. The living should take this to heart. Yes, there is a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. That's in chapter 3. But sorrow is better than laughter, according to chapter 7. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, and like a crackling of thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of fools. So you can see the relationships there between those two chapters. We'll divide these first 14 verses in chapter 7 into three major sections. Finding instruction in frustration and suffering in 7:1-6. Guarding your heart against foils to wisdom in verses 7-10. When I talk about a foil, in this case, I'm not talking about aluminum foil. I'm talking about things that work against wisdom. And then finally, it's a bit of a conclusion in verses 11-14, recognizing that while on the one hand wisdom is indispensable, life is ultimately in the hand of God. All right, let's look first at finding instruction in frustration and suffering. Subpoint there, the end is better than the beginning, verse 1. A good name is better than a good ointment, and the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. Another way to translate this is what I mentioned earlier. As a good name is better than a good ointment, so the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. It kind of helps you see the connection between the two statements. Now, when Solomon uses the term name here and good name, he's not saying that it's better to have a name like Frank versus Matt or David, even though that may be true. He's not talking about a name in that sense. He's talking about name in the sense of a reputation, being known as a righteous and upstanding in character individual. Or put another way, a good reputation, especially to the end of life, is highly desirable. And the ointment here could be, ointment was a very significant part of Israel's culture. They used it to anoint your head. They would use it to do what we would call a rub down today. They used ointment and spices and different kinds of anointing materials for someone when they died. But what Solomon is saying here is a good name, a good reputation is better than that kind of very valued physical treatment. He affirms this in Proverbs 22:1. A good name is to be more desired than great riches. Favor is better than silver and gold. Of course, it's hard to build a good reputation over the course of your life, and it's very easy to lose it. One misstep, one bad decision, one ill-timed word, or one yielding to temptation can wipe out a good reputation. So it's especially desirable to have that kind of reputation at the very end of your life, when you're about to be buried. It's hard to maintain, but it's very valuable to have. And that's why the end is better than the beginning. All right? So not only is the end better than the beginning, but mourning is better than mirth, and sorrow is better than laughter. Verses 2 through 4. It's better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. Another way that we can think about that today, it's better to go to a funeral than to a party. Why? Because that is the end of every man. What is that? What is the end of every man? Death. That's what happens at a funeral. That's what the focus is. That is the end of every man, and the living takes it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter. For when a face is sad, a heart may be happy, is the way that the NAS translates that. I think it's better to think of that as a heart may be put right. Not necessarily that you're going to be happy the way that we normally think about it when you have a sad face, but your heart is going to be in a place that it needs to be. It's going to be thinking seriously about things that need to be thought about. The mind of the wise is in the house of mourning, while the mind of fools is in the house of pleasure. The bottom line is we think more of the important issues of life when we're confronted with death than when we're being entertained. Mind here in verse 4 indicates a perspective, kind of a framework that through which you live life. Moses wrote in Psalm 90 verse 12, so he's speaking to God in this psalm, so teach us to number our days, that we may present to thee a heart of wisdom. Now, he's not literally talking about counting off your days so that at the end of your life you know how long you've lived. What he's talking about here is recognizing that our days are numbered by God already. That after death we'll have to stand before him in judgment. And then it pays to live in wisdom now in light of that future judgment. That kind of thinking creates a perspective that affects the way that you make decisions. It really has a tremendous effect on the way that you live your life. There's many people out there that don't want to think about death. They don't want to think about what's beyond death, and it makes a big difference on their life as well. It is the wise man rather than the fool that's going to have this more sober perspective. Now, Solomon's not saying here that there's no value in entertainment or feasting. I mean, you can read Ecclesiastes and really kind of get jolted to one end and not see the balance that he's trying to maintain. Feasting was a significant part of the life of Israel. They gathered as a regular part of their calendar to celebrate God's provision in this feast. And entertainment is not a bad thing. He's not saying that it's better to be an Eeyore or a sad sack all the time. He's already made it clear that there is joy and satisfaction to be had in this life for the one who knows and fears the Lord. But he's also made it clear that the fool doesn't do that. He doesn't live his life in light and fear of the Lord. He often seeks pleasure and entertainment as the ultimate goal in life. Go for the gusto. Get all that you can get in this life. Solomon's made it clear that if that's your aim, you're going to be sorely disappointed. He says again in Proverbs 21:17, he who loves pleasure will become a poor man. He who loves wine and oil will not become rich. Now, verse 4, Solomon introduced a comparison between the wise and the foolish, and that's one that's going to continue through the next several verses. Again, that's very typical for proverbial kind of literature. We see it a lot in the book of Proverbs, and we're going to be cross-referencing the Proverbs as we've already been doing, even more as we go along here. Let's see, I'm in verses 5 and 6. Did I go too fast there? Yeah. Verses 5 and 6. Instructive rebuke is better than entertainment. Verse 5. It's better to listen to the rebuke of a wise man than for one to listen to the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorn bushes under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool, and this too is futility. Now that last part needs a little explanation. In Solomon's day, thorns were used the way that we would use what we call kindling or tinder. It's the small branches that you use to make a fire and get it burning quickly so that you can burn the bigger logs on top. I like to make fires, and I go out and gather sticks in my yard. My grandsons help me do that. They know that that's the way it works. You get the kindling first, and then you build a bigger fire. Well, what Solomon is doing here is comparing the laughter of a fool to thorns in the sense of the way that they use them to build a fire. They light very quickly. They kind of explode with light and fire, but they burn out very quickly as well. They're not going to keep you warmed up the way a real fire will. So the laughter of a fool may seem like a good thing, right? It may seem like he's happy, he's trying to make you happy, he's trying to impart some joy, but that feeling only lasts for a short period of time. It's fleeting, and it carries no long-term good. These verses provide a contrast between the wise and the foolish, but in this case, it's how we take or respond to the wise versus the foolish man. A wise man will rebuke us when we're going off the right path. And while a rebuke is harder for us to listen to than the praise of a fool, it's better for us in the long run. A wise man offers it to us for our good. And if we're wise, we'll receive it for the purpose for which it's offered. Now, Solomon addresses this several places in the book of Proverbs. He says in Proverbs 31, a wise son accepts his father's discipline, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. Proverbs 17:10, a rebuke goes deeper into one who has an understanding, that would be another way of saying a wise man, than 100 blows into a fool. Proverbs 27:6, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. So something that's not easy to do. When you have to rebuke someone, you have to keep in mind that you're doing it for their long-term good, and I think you have to communicate to them that you're doing it for their long-term good. It's still not an easy thing to do. It's not something that we enjoy doing, but Scripture is very clear, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, that it's the better thing to do. It's better. It's what the wise man does, and if we're wise, we will receive that rebuke and respond accordingly. The fool is just concerned with having a good time, not worrying about the future, not worrying about judgment. He doesn't care about morality. He doesn't care about facing God at the end of his life. The wise man lives with an end in mind. The fool lives for the present, for all the sensual pleasure he can get out of life in the present. All right? As we get to verse 7, we enter a section that begins a section of wisdom warnings against two things, or you could summarize them in two ways. The first are things that affect our hearts. Man's heart, and the fact that it has been corrupted by his original fall, is an issue in much of what Solomon writes in the book of Ecclesiastes. In fact, at the end of chapter 7, we get to next week, he says, behold, I have found only this, that God made man upright. That is, before the fall, man didn't have sin, and you can't blame the fall on God. He made man upright. He made man as part of the creation that he had declared all good. But, we'll expound on that more when we get to 7:29, but the issue there is that man's heart is corrupted. It's corrupted by the fall into sin, and he's constantly battling that. We're constantly battling that. Solomon's trying to make us aware of that. The other thing that he's doing here in these verses that follow, in 7 through 14, are warning us about things that work against wisdom. Remember, that's what he's doing in this chapter. That's what he's doing in several places in the book of Ecclesiastes. He's providing wisdom to deal with these difficulties that came about as a result of the fall. But he also wants to make us aware of things that work against wisdom. Let's look at oppression and a bribe in verse 7. For oppression makes a wise man mad. I think mad there, not in the sense of angry, but crazy. And a bribe corrupts the heart. And we talked about this already too. Those that have power and influence are especially suspect to corruption. Power, what is it? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Solomon himself wrestled with this. I mean, this was a man who rose to the height of power, had all the wisdom that he needed, had all the money that he needed, had a worldwide reputation, worldwide connections. and yet he oppressed his own people. A bribe, especially if it's large enough, can also corrupt the heart even of a wise man. Just think about the impact that money has on us. And it's not the paper that we have in our wallet or the coins in our pocket. It's the fact we think about what we can do when we have more money. And that drives us in many ways. Maybe not so much when you're younger, even though I can see already in my very young grandsons the desire to have things and the recognition that more money, enables them to have those things. Money can have a real impact on our thinking and on our desires, on our actions. And we've got to be careful about that. That's why the Bible warns us so much against the love of money. All right, verse 8, haughtiness of spirit. The end of a matter is better than its beginning. We saw that back in verse 1. Patience of spirit is better than haughtiness of spirit. Now, how is it that you get patience? Do you get it when everything goes smoothly in life? No. There's no need for it then. Patience is developed as you go through difficulties in life. It's something that you have to develop to maintain that good name that Solomon's already talked about, that reputation. There's also a close connection between patience and humility. We are literally bags of dirt, right? We're dirt bags. We're made out of the dirt of the ground, the original man was, and we return to dust when we die. And if you have that perspective, then you don't think, well, I'm entitled or I deserve better than this. You don't have an attitude of pride. And that can go a long ways towards developing patience. Patience waits on God. It rests in His sovereign timing. It recognizes that He's going to allow things into our life, difficulties, to develop patience and to develop our character in other ways. A lack of patience, which Solomon calls here haughtiness of spirit, is closely tied to pride. And of course, the book of Proverbs has a lot to say about pride and humility. Proverbs 8:13. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Pride and arrogance and the evil way and the perverted mouth I hate. Proverbs 11:2. When pride comes, then comes dishonor, but with the humble is wisdom. Proverbs 16:18 and 19. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling. It's better to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. Proverbs 29:23. A man's pride will bring him low, but a humble spirit will attain honor. James talked about humbling yourself in the sight of the Lord, and at the right time He will exalt you. That's a perspective issue as well. God will glorify us in the end, but He calls us now to be humble, to be willing to serve, not to think more highly of ourselves than we ought to think. All right, another foil to wisdom is anger. Do not be eager in your heart to be angry, for anger resides in the bosom of fools. Lack of patience will also make us eager to anger, susceptible to foolishness in both words and deeds. Again, Proverbs speaks to this numerous places. He who is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who is quick-tempered exalts folly. 15:18. A hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but the slow to anger pacifies contention. You've been in situations where a wrong word or somebody losing their cool just really inflames the whole situation. And yet you've probably been in a situation as well where the right kind of answer and the right kind of response to someone else who's already angry makes all the difference in the world. He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who captures a city. It's a hard thing to do, not to get angry, not to get impatient, but it's the stronger thing to do. It's the thing that God wants us to do. A man of great anger shall bear the penalty, for if you rescue him, you will only have to do it again. Proverbs 22:24 and 25. Do not associate with a man given to anger, or go with a hot-tempered man, lest you learn his ways and find a snare for yourself. So not only is there an admonition not to get angry yourself, be careful about associating with people that are given to anger. Finally, Proverbs 29:8-9, scorners set a city aflame, but wise men turn away from anger. A wise man has a controversy with a foolish man. The foolish man either rages or laughs, and there is no rest. Right? Here's another foil to wisdom, harmful reminiscing. This one's funny to me. It's something that you see, I think, as you get older, and I think I'm officially in that category now because I catch myself doing this more than I used to. Do not say, why is it that the former days were better than these? For it's not from wisdom that you ask about this. I think every generation does this, right? Every generation looks back at when they were younger and says, boy, I wish it was like that again. Those were the good old days. The problem is, it's just not accurate. We're very selective about the things that we remember. We tend to remember the best things about our earlier days and amplify those and minimize the bad things. Solomon says it's not from wisdom that we do this. He's not saying that you shouldn't have good memories of former days. That's not what he's saying at all. But if you constantly live in that state of mind and you think that the present day is not worth living anymore, it's very easy to become bitter and long for the good old days in a way that's not healthy. And that can actually rob you of joy in the present day. Well, as we've gone through Ecclesiastes and as we've looked at Proverbs also, we've seen that Solomon has a lot to say about wisdom. He talked very early in the book of Ecclesiastes how he had increased in wisdom more than all who preceded him. He talked to us about how his wisdom stood by him even as he was exploring folly. He talked about the limitations of wisdom, and especially the fact that both the wise man and the fool are going to die. He has more to say about wisdom here in chapter 7. In fact, he's going to draw another conclusion at the end of this unit in 11 through 14. It's very important for us to understand the relationship of wisdom to something else. And just to understand that wisdom is really good on the one hand, but it's not absolute. That's what he says in verses 11 and 12. Wisdom is indispensable. Wisdom, along with inheritance, is good. It's an advantage to those who see the sun. It's the same as being under the sun. For wisdom is protection, just as money is protection. But the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the lives of its possessors. Here Solomon's comparing wisdom to money as a means of protection. David raised the question earlier, if it's sin to be poor, and it's not, but it's also not an inherent virtue to be poor. And let's face it, when you're faced with different situations and even crises in life, it's better to have money than not to have it. There's certain things you can do with money that you can't do if you don't have it. Like riches, wisdom also protects in that way, but at a much deeper level. It says it preserves the lives of its possessors. How so? Because a wise person, in general, a person that's living by the admonitions in the book of Proverbs, lives more safely. He doesn't take as many risks. He makes better decisions. And all those things put together tend to extend one's life. And again, it's not a guarantee. You can live by wisdom and still die young. But in general, a person that lives according to wisdom lives longer. On the other hand, a person can have all the money in the world, but if he drives too fast, if he has an appetite for drugs and alcohol, if he lives a riskier lifestyle than somebody who's living by wisdom, if he scorns the way of wisdom himself, he has a better chance of, for example, wrapping his car around a tree and dying early. Let's hear some Proverbs that speak to this. Verse 14:27, the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, that one may avoid the snares of death. 27:12, a prudent man sees evil and hides himself. The naive, which is another name for the foolish, proceed and pay the penalty. If you think about it, the book of Proverbs, the first 7 chapters, Solomon is making the case for wisdom. He's encouraging the young people in his kingdom to live by wisdom. Part of what he says, and I think kind of a good summary of those first 7 chapters, is found in chapter 3, verses 13 to 17. How blessed is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gains understanding. For its profit is better than the profit of silver, and its gain than fine gold. She, wisdom, is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire compares with her. Long life is in her right hand. In her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. Even an unbeliever can live according to the wisdom of Proverbs and prosper. Now, it's not going to be the same. He's not going to have the ultimate wisdom of fearing the Lord. But God has so designed life and so built into creation, the fabric built into creation wisdom, that if you live by the principles of Proverbs, even as an unbeliever, you're going to have a better chance of living long than somebody that doesn't. So on the one hand, wisdom is indispensable, but life is in the hand of God. Solomon's already made this point in Ecclesiastes 1:15 and 3:11. 1:15 says, what is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I'm sorry, I didn't read 13 and 14. Will somebody do that for me? Verses 13 through 14. Anybody? Go ahead.
Consider the work of God, keep straight what he has made crooked. The day of prosperity will be joyful, and in the day of mercy consider that God has made the one as well as the other, so that man might have anything that he has.
That is great wisdom to live by. It's a verse that I have come to appreciate more over the past week because of the circumstances in our family. God calls us to rejoice when good things happen to us. And that's easy enough for us to do. But we have to recognize that when we face adversity, God's in control of that as well. That will change the way that you deal with life, all of life. And again, Solomon made this point back in 1:15 in a little bit different way. What is crooked cannot be straightened, what is lacking cannot be counted. In other words, God controls everything. There's certain things that he does that you can't do anything about, and you just need to embrace it. He also says in chapter 3, verse 11, God has made everything appropriate in its time. He's also set eternity in their hearts so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. That sounds like the same thing he's saying in 7:14. So wisdom is desirable and much better than foolishness, but it's not feel safe. Ultimate wisdom is trusting in and depending upon God, both in prosperity and adversity. Of course, I know we've done this several times already. I think it bears repeating. The ultimate example we have of this in Scripture is from Job. Job clearly demonstrates on 2 different occasions that he believed this. First, after he lost all his possessions and his children in Job 1, what did he do? Did he curse God? No. He fell down and worshipped. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Verse 22 says, through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. Well, that wasn't enough. Even after losing his health, in addition to everything else he's lost, and with his wife urging him to curse God and die, to give up on his claim to hold fast to his integrity, Job says, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? That is a strong recognition of the sovereignty of God and his right to do whatever he wants to do over our lives, even to overrule the normal outcomes of living by wisdom. J.S. Wright is a well-known commentator on the book of Ecclesiastes. Here's the way that he sums it up. Part of the life of faith is accepting prosperity and adversity from God's hand without being able to explain just how everything will be worked out for the future. It's good words to live by. Well, next week we'll look at part 2 of this chapter from 15 to 29, and we'll see that it really is continuing in the same vein that we've looked at this morning. We're calling it Wisdom for Living. It's responses to the different issues that Solomon's raised in the first 6 chapters. Let's pray together. Father, one of the things that we learn as we read through Scripture, especially as we read through it in different places and over time, is how essential the fear of the Lord is. We come to know you better. We come to know your attributes better. We come to recognize what fearing you means. And we come to recognize that the way that we express our fear, a proper kind of fear, is through obedience. We recognize at the same time that you've made us sons and daughters, those of us that have trusted in Christ as our Lord and Savior, and that this fear doesn't mean that it's not like being a slave. It's a different kind of fear, but it is a reverence for you and for your character, and a recognition that you are our judge, a perfect judge who has all the facts, but our judge. You're the one that made us. You're the one that has redeemed us. You're the one that will judge us, even as a believer, as a child of God. Lord, I just pray that that will be more part of our thinking, that that will be a real reality in our minds, and then that will find expression in the way that we live and walk before you in our lives under the sun. Thank you for this book of Ecclesiastes. It's a strange book in some ways, but there's not another one like it in Scripture that deals with these hard issues. We just thank you that you inspired Solomon to write it, that you gave him the wisdom to investigate these issues, and that we can learn from his wisdom and his counsel as to how we ought to live and obey you. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.